Okay, hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is IPA's Education Sector webinar on gender gaps in education. So just to kick things off here, I'd like to quickly outline our time together today. We're going to begin with some welcome and introductions, and also quickly address the webinar tech and policy, and then briefly describe some of the background and motivation. So some of the work that has inspired our interest in this topic and our approach to the discussion today. And then the bulk of the webinar will focus on the presentation of 3 different research papers. And these are all available right now, either as working papers or as published documents, and included in the initial webinar invitation. So we please encourage you to follow up and look at the full papers themselves if you're interested based upon the presentations today. And we will follow the research presentations with reflections from discussants and policy representatives. After we conclude that reflection period, we will open it up to Q&A from audience participation. So please feel free to submit questions or topics for discussion at any point throughout the webinar. So this is using the Q&A feature as part of Zoom. We will be moderating that throughout the course of the presentations today. So please feel free to use that. We will also try to flag whether we will try to address any questions live during the discussion period, or we can also directly comment and follow up in the Q&A feature itself. Closed captioning is available in English. Please feel free to use that if that is useful for you. Also, this webinar will be recorded and posted on IPA's website following the presentation today. So if you'd like to follow up with anything that is available. If you have any technical issues, please contact my colleague, Brianda. And so that leads me to our initial introductions. So my name is Sarah Kabay. I am IPA's Education Program Director. And I am joined today by my colleagues, Kiasyo Isika and Brianda Romero-Castellan. And we're really excited to be able to connect with you today and hoping that this is the beginning of a number of education sector webinars. So thank you again so much for joining us. Vicki and I will be presenting a small qualitative study that we've been working on. And then we're really excited to be joined by 2 additional research presentations. So we have Rebecca Thornton joining us from Baylor University and Laura Gregory from the World Bank. So thanks both to them. We're really excited for their upcoming presentations. And then as our discussant, we're really grateful for Debbie Odenye to be joining us from Girl Rising as their Kenya country manager to represent the practice experience. So we're really excited that our discussion period will include both experiences and insight from fields of practice, and then also policy reflections. So we have 2 representatives from the policy perspective. So we have Mr. Munga Hakayamba from the Examinations Research Council of Zambia, and Phyllis Movindu from the Ministry of Education in Kenya. We're really grateful for their participation today to share their expertise and experience working on this topic from a policy perspective. So just to describe some of the background and motivation we have for this work. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, we were working on a number of different initiatives to try to support children's learning while schools were closed. And one example of that was we had a research project in Kenya that was trying to develop an educational service that could be used on the most basic of phones. So it wouldn't require an internet connection or any smartphone capabilities. So we're working on this during the pandemic to try to sort of support children's learning. And this research project gave us the opportunity to conduct some qualitative research. So because this broader research project was focused on distance learning, the primary research questions for this qualitative exercise was try to understand different users' experience. So how are they engaging with this educational service? How could it be adapted or modified to better suit their needs? So that was the primary sort of inspiration for conducting this research. But then because of the timing, this gave us a really unique opportunity to get insight on the period of school closures and the return to school. So you can see here the timeline for school closures in Kenya during the 2020 and 2021 academic years. And you can see our interviews with households and our interviews with teachers were conducted right at the beginning of the return to school. So from these 2 periods, this gave us a really unique opportunity to connect with these key stakeholders and get their insights and reflections on this, sort of extremely turbulent period for education. And one of the key themes that emerged from these qualitative data was an emphasis on boys' lives and education. And this wasn't something that we had anticipated or sort of planned for in our interviews, but it really emerged as a key theme. And you'll see as we begin to present some of these data that key stakeholders were really grappling with their understanding of different gender narratives and how that supported or challenged some of their own direct observations of students and children in their communities. And so this really seemed like a very important topic that was both represented in our data, but then also highlighting that this was a really important issue to investigate further. And so then this also resonated with some of our policy conversations. So our IPA Kenya team has been involved in some of the ongoing work to revise the country's education sector gender policy. But then even looking at the existing policy, we see this emphasis that the gender policy has a wide perspective for equality. This includes both boys and girls, women and men. This is not just a focus on girls and men. But being involved in some of these conversations and presenting available research, a number of different stakeholders have recognized that we have limited data and research on boys. And so this concerns their lives both in and out of school. This addresses the school closure period and longer term trends. So there really seemed to be this demand and interest in understanding more about the perspective of boys' lives and education. And so this was, sort of a primary motivation for us to look into this issue further with our qualitative data that we had collected as part of this other research project, but then also to create a forum to discuss this. Because I think we've also seen anecdotally across a number of research projects, different trends on educational performance and seeing, particularly for certain academic outcomes or learning outcomes, girls are often scoring higher than boys. But when it's not the primary research question, it's often something that isn't discussed, or we haven't seen very many, sort of broad conversations directly looking at this issue. So we thought that a webinar would be a great opportunity to present some of the work that we've been looking at, but then also connect to some of the research and data that does exist on this topic. So we're really excited for today. The 3 research presentations we've looked at as highlighting 3 different levels of perspective. So my colleague Vicky and I are co-authors on this qualitative study from Kenya. So we're initially going to present this topic looking at gender and the return to school in Kenya. Then Rebecca is going to present her and her colleagues' paper that's looking at a regional perspective. So this is using nationally representative data from Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania, looking at basic learning outcomes and understanding the gender differences there. And then finally, Laura is going to present her and her colleagues' report looking at this issue from a global perspective. So utilizing international data sets and other resources to see, some of these trends from a really high level perspective. So we thought this would be, sort of a great opportunity as, an initial exploratory step to see what data exist, what might we already know about this topic, but then also how can we think about what needs to be learned moving forward. So again, please feel free to use the Q&A feature to be able to ask questions or raise any topics for discussion or comment at any point during our presentations today. But for now, I'm going to kick us off by introducing Vicky and my paper on gender and the return to school in Kenya. So this is currently a working paper that we've been drafting, and we're going to present some initial insights here. So again, I'm going to start just very briefly describing our sample and methods. So again, this was initially conceived as a qualitative exercise as part of a broader research project looking at educational programming during school closures. And the initial intent was to learn about users' experience. So this is a relatively small qualitative study. So this is not a representative sample. But again, thinking of qualitative research, its advantages in identifying important issues and sort of hypothesis generating as being a key initial objective for this work. So we were able to interview both households and primary school teachers, but our reflections today are going to focus primarily on the teacher's perspective. Again, one of the most interesting aspects of this research was the timing, so that these interviews coincided with the return to school. So teachers and parents were able to reflect both on the very recent period when schools were closed, but then also this most recent period of the initial semester, the first return to school period. Then there was a second holiday, and again, the sort of subsequent return to school. So we used a semi-structured interview protocol, starting with very broad questions. So again, this was the way in which the issue of boys' education emerged, not as something we had initially programmed into our survey instrument or into the design of the study, but in response to some of these general questions, getting teachers and parents to reflect on, what was this past semester like for you? What has the return to school been like, and the period of school closures? This was conducted during the pandemic, so all interviews were conducted over the phone, recorded and transcribed. Co-author Vicky and I coded all the interviews in a process of open coding and using those data units to analyze key themes, and that's where this topic of boys' education really emerged. So just to quickly broadly give a sense of our key findings, a really important starting point is these stakeholders are recognizing the enduring challenges facing girls. So this is related to early marriage and pregnancy, but also girls' household responsibilities, all of these being critically important for girls' ability to engage meaningfully in education. These are both long-term trends, but then also potentially exacerbated by the pandemic. So that's a really important starting point, that this was broadly recognized by these respondents. But at the same time, about half of the teachers that we spoke to recognized that girls were scoring higher, doing better academically than boys. So I'll get into and share some of those quotes there, but sort of teachers seem to be pretty familiar with some of the challenges facing girls and equipped with various strategies to try and address them and support them. There seemed to be less awareness and more speculation concerning the challenges facing boys. And many teachers themselves were open to not, sort of recognizing that they didn't really fully understand, sort of what was going on there. Again, one of the reasons why we felt it was important to look into this issue and motivate, sort of future research to be able to support those key stakeholders in understanding and having tools in which to address these different trends. So then we'll focus a little bit more on this unpacking boys' underachievement. So in our data, 3 different theories were represented. So the first was economic, right? So boys' engagement in income generating activities during the school closure period and their interest in continuing those, potentially at the expense of education or returning to school. Then teachers emphasizing this theory of discipline challenges, particularly being unique to boys. But again, we'll see, and Vicky will talk about, how this is related to different narratives and gender and different framing of gender issues in relation to education. And then finally, this concerning trend where we already start to see a backlash amongst some of our participants, in that there's this perspective that an attention to girls or an overinvestment in girls' education might be undermining boys' performance in school. So really highlighting some of the concern and nuance and challenges of addressing these issues and thinking about how to have a constructive way forward and be able to make sure that these potentially negative framings for this issue aren't emphasized, and that there's a way in which to draw attention to boys' education in a way that doesn't undermine or address the incredibly important need to support girls' well-being and safety and educational experiences, but thinking about this inclusive approach to gender. So to quickly start out, the enduring challenges facing girls, many of the teachers in our sample expressed concern that rates of early pregnancy and marriage were increasing during the pandemic. And really important note that these observations were direct and specific. So as you can see here, all of our quotes that we'll be sharing today are in italics. So that's how you can recognize that these are quotes directly from the teachers in our interviews. And they're talking about specific cases, right? So girls that they know, girls in their school, in their community, sort of realizing that this was a major concern during the pandemic and then affecting girls' ability to return and engage in school afterwards. So this has been supported by some emerging research, right? So there are a couple studies in Kenya that have found that girls' sexual and reproductive health was negatively impacted by the pandemic. This also supports some broader research across multiple contexts about girls' vulnerability to various shocks, right? So this resonates with experiences from the Ebola epidemic in West Africa, but recognizing that girls are uniquely vulnerable and that school closures in particular can have negative impacts on their sexual and reproductive health. Also important to acknowledge that these trends can be very difficult to investigate. So the challenges around getting data, especially during the period of social distancing, sort of were young women still attending health centers or things like that, to recognize the need for really thoughtful and nuanced data on these issues. And also to note that as much as these trends might have increased during the pandemic, that these are also very long-term trends. So this is incredibly important work to support girls' sexual reproductive health, both in the period of disturbances like a pandemic, but then also even when that isn't, sort of the sort of status quo, and how important this is moving forward to recognize promoting equity in education will really need to address these concerns. So then moving towards this theme, about half of teachers, as much as they recognize this vulnerability of girls, were noting that they were doing better academically. And so you can see from some of these quotes that teachers were noting that they themselves were surprised, right? So we see this first quote here saying, they calculated the mean scores and were surprised that the mean scores of girls were higher than that of boys. And then this sort of uncertainty, right? We see in this second quote, a teacher saying, I don't know if it's from my area or the whole country, right? So this doesn't seem to be a topic that teachers are immediately familiar with or know much about, but that this is what they're observing in their schools, and they're sort of trying to contend with, sort of what this means and how pervasive it is, or sort of looking for more understanding about this. Also, not just recognizing these trends, but trying to explain them, right? So here we have an exchange between our interviewer and the respondent, and the interviewer is asking, why are boys lagging behind? And the respondent is saying, I don't know. I don't know what's going on. Those who are performing well now are girls. So just to contrast that, teachers tended to have much clearer theories about girls' challenges, right? So here's one example of a teacher talking about the household responsibilities that girls are given, and that this potentially takes away from the time that they can devote to education. And so that's one of the reasons. Again, just half of our teachers were noting that boys were not doing as well academically. And so this still highlights the need for services and intervention to support and understand the challenges facing girls and how can they be addressed to help them realize their full educational potential. But teachers seem to have these very clear theories around some of the issues facing girls that didn't seem to be as clear in the data that we have about boys, which we'll see moving forward here. So I'd love to turn it over now to my colleague and co-author, Vicky, to present about the theories that were present in our data for teachers framing and understanding of boys' educational underachievement. So I'll turn it over to Vicky.
Thanks so much, Sarah. So in our sample, we identified 3 theories, as Sarah mentioned earlier, that enable teachers make sense of boys' underachievement in school. So the first one was economic-related theories, second one was indiscipline, and the third was investment. So in the subsequent slides, I'll be unpacking to give a full explanation of what this means. So next slide. Thanks. So in terms of the first pillar, so economic-related reasons, so many teachers in our samples mentioned that boys became more economically active while schools were closed, and therefore, preferred to focus on income-generating activities rather than returning to school. So, and then, of course, we have associated quotes there. You can see, one teacher saying or explaining this point by saying that boys generally preferred staying at home, and, and of course, making money was better for them than being in school. And another teacher is able to support that point, where they're able to express that boys were generally happy to get money from the motorbike business or boda business in Swahili, which is one of the dominating businesses that we could see in our narratives that boys were participating in, according to the teachers. And therefore, as a result of participating in these businesses, boys felt that going to school might be useless or irrelevant to them. Next slide. So also here we see other quotes related to that. So teachers were able to, again, express the fact that boys were telling them that they were used to getting their own money, and so bringing them back to school was not easy. And in some cases, one teacher was even able to express the fact that it was too difficult to the extent where some boys could even run away from school and, in order to participate in those economic activities. So when we did further analysis in this thematic area, we're able to also uncover the fact that economic opportunities for boys aligned with certain narratives of masculinity. So what does that exactly mean? So it meant that according to the teachers, they found that as a result of boys' access to money or these income-generating activities, they found it more attractive, right? Boys found it more attractive. It made them feel more manly or masculine. And so conversely, being portrayed as a student boy or, the studious boy imagery or depiction was less appealing to the boys. But at the same time, as we continued analyzing this data, we're also able to find out that, parents or caregivers also had a role to play in exposing boys to the workforce, right? So remember that this was during the pandemic, so many of parents and caregivers were either employed or underemployed. And so there was this need to supplement the household income. And so in most cases, from what we're seeing in our data, boys were often required to, work and then, add extra income for the household. So in general, boys' exposure to the job market and their interest in earning money made teachers feel that boys were disinterested in education and were very difficult to work with. And so these narratives were strongly connected with the second thematic area, which is indiscipline. So in line with this second theme or theory, so several teachers in our sample believe that boys' poor behavior was associated with lower academic performance. And, this quote here is able to signal that. So this teacher, for example, was able to basically say that, those high rates of indiscipline cases in their school and linking these, concerning disciplinary cases with boys relative to girls. Next slide. So multiple teachers described that guidance and counseling was a more effective or impactful strategy for supporting students' return to school. But this strategy, according to them, worked better for girls and not boys. So again, here we have shown an example, like a dialogue between an interviewer and a respondent. And so you're able to see here that the respondent, who is a teacher, is able to link girls' better performance than boys to their ability to respond quicker to guidance and counseling. Next slide. So we also saw that multiple teachers were concerned about boys being involved in drugs and alcohol, which obviously contributed to their behavioral issues. So again, here we see a quote from a teacher where they're able to suggest that guidance and counseling was also a strategy that was employed for boys who had disciplinary issues. But then when we also looked at our data a little bit more, we wondered whether, it seemed as though teachers seemed better equipped to tackle challenges relating to girls when schools resume. So a lot of the, narratives were able to suggest that, teachers felt equipped to mentor girls, to provide safe learning spaces for them, especially pregnant girls, in order to encourage them to come to school. But implicitly, it seemed as though teachers were less equipped to handle struggles that were unique to boys, such as drugs and alcohol, as I mentioned. Next slide. But despite this, we saw at least one teacher who noted that those issues, the drugs and alcohol addiction, might not have been as prevalent as people are saying or people thought. That, things that were more concerning were these that were associated with boys' participation in the workforce. So like, as I said, the boda or the motorbike businesses. So that's what we should really pay attention to. So it's really possible that sensational topics like drugs and alcohol get a lot of attention, but they're actually not very prevalent in this context. So on to our third pillar or theory. So some teachers in our sample were able to cite that investment in girls' education in Kenya before and during the pandemic was a reason as to why boys were declining academically. So there are two quotes here that we put. So the first one, of course, suggesting that, there's a lot of monitoring for the girl child, like organizations are really favoring girls by way of investing in their education and therefore neglecting boys' education. And then similarly, another quote from a different teacher suggesting the same, that there's a lot of focus on the female gender. And so the male gender tends to be sidelined in the process. And so in line with these findings, another assumption could be that, maybe these large investments in girls' education, large investments in policy and programming that are in favor of girls, maybe that might suggest why teachers were, felt less equipped to support troublesome or underachieving boys at school. Next. So in terms of conclusion and key takeaways, so I think the main takeaway here is obviously that more research is needed to better understand boys' experiences in and out of school and how this relates to their academic performance. It's also important to note that boys face unique challenges in education, which should be addressed. But however, recognizing that boys face unique challenges in education doesn't mean that boys and girls must be in competition for these educational resources. right? And also recognizing these unique experiences that boys face in the education space can and should be done without undermining the importance of girls' safety and well-being in education. And it also should be done without ignoring the unique challenges that girls are experiencing or girls experienced before, during, and after the pandemic, as Sarah was saying, early marriages, pregnancies, etc. So yeah, that's it from me. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much. So that's our first presentation. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca to share our second research presentation.
Perfect. Thank you very much for this opportunity to present some of our work. We're still staying in East Africa, so we are going to be looking at 3 East African countries, Tanzania, Uganda, and Kenya. And this is joint work with 2 colleagues, Julie Bull-Wiggers and Sam Jones. So historically, literacy and numeracy, if we look across the world, has been overall lower among women. However, recent education gender gaps have emerged, both in terms of literacy and numeracy, especially in literacy, but also in attendance, dropout, etc. Most of that we have seen has been among higher income countries. And so we were interested in what does it look like in sub-Saharan Africa, and trying to answer that. Now, what we became interested in is 2 specific empirical challenges to try to best measure these gaps quantitatively. So the first issue is that there was a lot of data available, especially with studies that go into schools and measure education outcomes and learning in school samples. But the problem with that is that if there is dropouts of, and especially differential dropouts, where girls or boys are dropping out differently at different rates, or if that dropout is correlated with their ability, then we're going to have a biased sample in terms of measuring gender gaps in learning outcomes. The second issue is that there also might be differences in households that have lots of boys or lots of girls, or have boys that we're measuring, or if there is something with that sample. And so one solution that we attempt to do in this paper, and that we use with data that help us to overcome these 2 issues, is first we use household surveys that have learning outcomes in them, which allow us to avoid problem 1 with the in-school sample. And the second is that we use household fixed effects, or in other words, we compare within households that have both a boy and a girl to difference out anything that might be different about households that might have girls or might have more boys. And so that allows us to see the gender gaps, stripping out these 2 empirical challenges. So this paper uses the WASO data. It's publicly available. There are 6 rounds of data from 2010 to 2015 with children in households ages 6 to 16. We've got a very large sample of these children in Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, and they gave literacy and numeracy tests. So we're going to take those literacy and numeracy tests, and we are going to standardize them. Now, why do we do that? We don't want to compare apples to oranges. And when you go, if you took an exam in math, you might have one way that you score, but if you went and took a test in, say, religion or history or something else, you might score in a different way. So in order to compare these 2, we're going to standardize them. And so all of our results are in standard deviation. It tells us essentially where in the distribution you're scoring. And then we use this fancy term called household fixed effect, which essentially just means we put in a control to identify the household that each kid is in. So this is going to be among those that have both a boy and a girl, siblings, within the same household. we're going to compare how is the girl doing versus the boy doing on these standardized tests. So these are our results. And I'm going to start with literacy before I flash that. What we expect with literacy in higher income countries is that girls are doing better. So the question is that happening in Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda? And these are our results. These are measured in standard deviations. And in just 2 slides, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about how to think about these numbers, about how big they are. So let's look just at a couple things. First is, if we go, these things called FE, fixed effects, means that we are putting in controls in the regression. That's all that means. So what we're going to do is that we're going to put in more specific controls until we get to the purple bars that have those household controls. That's where we're comparing the siblings of the brothers versus the sisters. And what we see is that as we put in more controls, we're getting slightly smaller gender gaps. So we're able to bring down any potential bias that might be in our estimates. And so then when we get to our preferred estimates, which are the purple bars, we're seeing that we've got differences of about 0.09 standard deviations in Kenya, 0.06 standard deviations in Tanzania, and also in Uganda. These are for literacy. Then we go to numeracy. Now, numeracy and math is where typically we see that on average, lots of places, boys do better. What does that look like in our data? Well, here we see the girls are doing better. Not only are they doing better, but it's about half the size of the gender gap in literacy, but it's still, these boys are doing better. And our preferred estimates are around 0.05 in Kenya and Tanzania, and about 0.03 in Uganda. Now, what do these numbers mean? How big are these? Lots of us are not used to thinking in standard deviations. So a couple things to think about. One additional year of schooling in Kenya and Uganda, if we look at that in our data, is equal to about 0.25 standard deviations. Or in Tanzania, it's equal to about 0.13 standard deviations. That's one way to think about this in terms of thinking about these 0.09s or 0.04, how big is this? Another way to think about this is if we go in and we did a program to help people to learn how to read or to do math, in particular with reading, the citation that I'm going to give, is that an average program in low-income countries from a meta-analysis is finding that the average intervention increases test scores by about 0.11 standard deviation. So another way to think about this in light of that is that these gender gaps are approximately equal to an extra 2 to 6 months of schooling, or about an average or a moderate intervention. Okay, what else did we do? We looked at this of how did this vary by age. So is it the case that that gender gap is always there, or does that grow? Is it something that kicks in around puberty, or is it something that kicks in earlier? And this is what we find in Kenya. It's very similar in Uganda and Tanzania, is that we see it's pretty stable. It's got kind of a upside down U shape, but it doesn't suggest anything that we would have thought that this is kicking in more, say around puberty, or differences that might be going on when the boys might be going more into the workforce, for example. We also looked at variation across East Africa, and I'm going to show you a map of these 3 countries, and I'm going to show you 2 different colors where either in districts where the boys are doing better versus the girls are doing better, because what all those other numbers were averages. So what does that look like geographically? So here we see with the red, that's where the boys are doing worse, and in the blue is when the girls are doing worse. And for those of you who are familiar to some of this geography, up in that blue area, up in Kenya and up in northern Uganda, is really some more remote areas that have more poverty associated to that. Now that is very similar to our overall findings of some mechanisms where we look at some different subgroups. We find that girls are less likely to drop out and they complete more schooling, about 2 months of schooling. We do some analysis and find that that explains some of the gap in learning, but definitely not all of it. We find that girls are doing worse in ultra poor households, similar to those geographic maps, when they have uneducated mothers or less educated mothers. and in areas where there are higher rates of girls' labor force participation, so where there's an opportunity cost to their school. We find that girls do better where there's higher adult female labor participation, so where there's a higher return to their skills, which is similar to other literature that has been found in South Asia, for example. And then we find no differences in the gap across different levels of decision-making, fertility, age of marriage, exceptions of domestic violence, nothing there. So in conclusion, we find sizable gaps in favor of girls across East Africa, even in numeracy, where we don't always see gaps, but we still see those in these areas in East Africa. But there's also important variation across geography and characteristics of households. And so further studies and further interest in learning about what's leading to these gaps and about how to best support these boys and the girls. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Incredibly fascinating. I'm so excited for our upcoming opportunity for discussion and reflection. But now I'd like to turn it over to Laura to present our third research presentation.
Thank you, Sarah. Can you just confirm you're seeing my presentation? Great.
Looks great.
Thanks very much. And good morning to everybody. It's a pleasure to be here today and to share in this discussion and hear about these fascinating studies. About 2 years ago, my colleague Michelle Wellman and I published a global report at the World Bank of our study on educational underachievement among boys and men. And in our report, we described the issue of educational underachievement as being one of three things: either low levels of participation in education, low rates of completion or graduation, and low student learning outcomes. And then we look at the phenomenon or the prevalence of educational underachievement among boys and men globally, why it matters, what is possibly explaining it, what has been done about it, and we propose a way forward. So in terms of the phenomenon, in more than 100 countries, boys are less likely to be enrolled in secondary education. And as you can see here, young men are less likely to be enrolled in tertiary education, while in primary education, the gap tends to be small overall. And on top of this, the proportions finishing their programs in tertiary education are substantially lower for men than for women. And for high-income countries, this is not a new development. But it appears that the occurrence of this gap has become increasingly common in middle-income countries. And the issue starts much younger. The learning poverty rate, which is the percentage of children who are unable to read a simple text with understanding by the time they're 10 years of age, is higher for boys than girls in almost all of the approximately 100 countries of the world for which learning poverty data is available. And this is especially an issue in the Middle East and North Africa region and the East Asia and Pacific regions, also where we have data, and among middle-income countries. And we see these differences also in science, especially at the secondary school level, and to a lesser extent in mathematics. And also, while boys appear to perform better on problem-solving skills, they're actually underperform on average in collaborative problem-solving, and this gap is even larger than the one for reading. We see that the issue affects all country income levels to some degree, but seems to become more predominant as countries develop economically to middle-income countries and high-income countries. So it's perhaps has something to do with the lag between education expansion and the quality of education. We also see that it tends to occur more among the less advantaged and the least proficient, and it's generally greater in rural areas compared to urban areas, at least in two-thirds of the countries. In terms of why this matters, our report discusses it in terms of being a brake on human capital development, and we provide estimates of the effect on countries' productivity if the underachievement of boys was eradicated, if they achieved as well as girls do in each country. And we also look at the social and political consequences. Then in terms of what explains it, we structured our report within a framework consisting of three key elements. Firstly, labour market influences that contribute to underachievement. Secondly, social norms that might encourage or reinforce underachievement. And thirdly, characteristics of educational processes or teaching and learning that may unintentionally promote underachievement. Given the limited time for today, I'm going to focus on the last one. In fact, the first two were very well covered in the first two presentations. And I think specifically this last one, teaching and learning, is personally, I think the most interesting, but also the one that I think there's probably less discussion at the moment. So we found that the commonly held belief that boys and girls have different learning styles and that instruction needs to be to match those styles is not based on evidence. Instead, we found that it's useful to examine what boys bring to their schooling experiences compared to girls. That is their prior knowledge and skills, and the degree to which they engage in learning, which can be affected by social norms. There is some evidence that boys begin formal education with less developed social and behavioral skills, and that some of these differences can affect educational achievement. But there's also strong evidence to suggest that these non-cognitive skills are malleable and dependent on the environment. We found that there's little and mixed evidence to support the theory that boys are inherently less motivated than girls to achieve at school in general. And then in terms of the classroom, we saw that there's little support for the idea of boy-friendly or girl-friendly pedagogies, and that those pedagogies that appeal to boys are just as girl-friendly. In fact, they characterize quality teaching. The school and classroom climate appears to be important for all kids, and especially for boys. For example, schools with mostly boys, more than 60%, were less likely to have positive reports of the disciplinary climate. This comes from the PISA data. And there's evidence that disciplinary problems in the classroom have a bigger impact on boys' performance. We also see a greater sense of belonging among all-girls schools, particularly in the countries that have mostly single-sex schooling. And one of the most interesting findings is that boys seem to be more affected by school quality, more harmed by bad schools, and more likely to gain from good schools. In terms of some of the implications of these findings, we can see that engaging boys in the learning process is crucial, but it's also not something new. The approaches to teaching and learning that are known to be effective for all students are all relevant to the discussion of boys' learning and to any children and young people at risk of poor educational outcomes. With school and classroom climates having a greater impact on boys, working with school leadership becomes very important, not exclusively for the purpose of raising boys' attainment, but because it's important for all students. And we mentioned some of the types of whole school systematic approaches to help improve school climates. We note that some of the effects that have been made, the efforts that have been made to engage boys in reading, given it's such a fundamental skill for other learning, including evidence on the offering of a wide variety of texts and giving space for children to talk and reflect on their reading. And making sure that boys don't fall too far behind appears to be crucial. But of course, sometimes regular schooling just doesn't work, and alternative, less formal education paths have been found to be successful for some boys. And we do think that a lot more research is needed. But from what's available, we concluded that what works for girls' learning is also good for boys, though it might not be sufficient to help boys achieve better outcomes. I'd just like to end with a little update since our report. There've been a few data sets released since then, but the most interesting, I think, is IEA's International Civic and Citizenship Education Study, which tested 8th grade students across 24 countries or local regions, mostly in Europe, but also Brazil, Colombia, and Chinese Taipei. And it found that boys score lower on civic knowledge than girls. And this finding is consistent across all 3 cycles of this study. And no country had boys with higher scores than girls on civic knowledge, with the difference being equivalent to about a third of a level in the ICCS scale. And higher civic knowledge is important because it is associated with being more supportive of gender equality, more strongly endorsing equal rights for immigrants and all ethnic groups, being more open to diversity, being more supportive of environmental protection, and being more likely to expect to vote in elections. So some important implications there. That's it from me for my presentation. Back to you, Sarah, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura. And thank you everyone who has been contributing questions through the portal. I've been working to answer some, but please feel free to continue to put in questions here, especially as we move towards our discussion. I'm quickly going to share my screen again, but turn it over to Vicky to briefly introduce our discussant and our policy representatives, and start with some initial questions for them. But again, please, everyone feel free to use the chat, or sorry, the Q&A function, so we can include some additional questions from you as well.
Thank you, Sarah. So I'll do a very quick reintroduction of our panelists. So we have Deborah Odeni, or Debbie, she likes going by Debbie. She is the Kenya Country Manager for Girls Rising. And we have Mr. Munga Hakaliamba, who works with the Examinations Council Board of Zambia, and he serves as the Principal Research Officer. And then finally, also from Kenya, we have Phyllis Mavindu, who's the Assistant Director of Education with the Ministry of Education, Kenya. So I'm happy to start with the question. And I think the first question, I'm curious to hear what Mr. Munga will say in relation to Zambia. So the first question goes like this. So do these current trends, or the trends that you've seen in these papers that we presented today, resonate with what you have observed in your work, and particularly so in your context, or are they surprising?
Thank you so much, and wonderful presentations there. Basically, what I can say on the presentations and the findings from the Zambian experience is that some of the issues that are coming are resonating well with what we've observed here in Zambia. But also in terms of the overall performance in terms of the boys and girls, for a Zambian perspective, we can't really say that girls are performing better than boys. There are certain areas where the boys are performing better than the girls, and the trend has been there. Maybe before I get to that one, in Zambia, we do what we call national assessments. We have also what we call large-scale assessments. We also participate in the PISA. And also we do examinations. So when we cross-pollinate the findings from the national assessments, which are not high-stake, and the exams, which are high-stake, there is a pattern that we are seeing that when it comes to access, the aspect of access, of course, there are more girls who are accessing at the primary as well as the lower secondary school in terms of access to education, because the candidature for girls is much higher as compared to that of the boys. But when they move to the senior secondary school, we are seeing the gap between the boys and girls being almost at par, meaning we are observing a lot of girls who are not progressing to senior secondary, which is basically the exit level to tertiary education. So in terms of access, yes, we are seeing more girls at the lower as well as the middle secondary school. And probably this one is coming from the aspect of the policies which the government has put in place. Of course, there has been so much focus in terms of keep the girls in school, the re-entry policies, which are all targeted towards the girls. So we are seeing in terms of access, more girls at that particular level. But when it comes to performance, in terms of achievements now, it seems to be like boys are doing well in certain categories. For instance, in the sciences, as well as in mathematics, we are seeing science-oriented, mathematics-oriented, boys are doing very well. But when it comes to the language as well as the practical subjects, again, we are seeing that girls tend to achieve higher at that particular, in that particular dimension. So basically for the Zambian perspective, it's a mixture. It's not a one direction kind of situation that I can say. We are seeing a mixture, and therefore we may not just say that maybe boys are underperforming or girls are underperforming. It's a mixture. There are dimensions where boys are doing well. There are dimensions where girls are not doing well. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Munga. Maybe I'll direct the same question to Phyllis. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more from your observation in the Kenyan context. Yes. Yeah, I don't think we can hear Phyllis. I don't know, Phyllis,
Phyllis, I believe you're on mute. Mhm.
Or as Phyllis sorts, technical issues, maybe I can turn over to.
I am on now.
Okay, cool.
Sorry for that technical
No worries,
issue.
no worries. Go ahead.
Yes. Thank you very much for the very good presentation that we have got from our three researchers. And taking it from the Kenyan side, actually, we can identify with a number of those findings. That, first and foremost, that girls and the boys have a number of challenges that they face in their bid to pursue their education goals. For sure, gender gaps and the barriers are there in education, even here in Kenya. And yeah, I'm thinking, just like we're saying that the disparities that occur between the girls and the boys, or the males and the females, because like in Kenya, you saw in the education sector gender policy, we normally address, we have done a policy that cuts across all levels of education, right from basic in Kenya refers to ECD, that is early childhood development education, primary. These days we talk of primary, junior secondary, and the senior secondary, and TVET and the university. So our policies cut across. And for sure, when we look at the differences between the genders, the sexes, we can say that there is comparable, or there is some indication that there are gender gaps that exist, and they are as a result of a number of issues. And some of them have actually been articulated in those researches. So to a great extent, we concur. However, it is actually true, like our colleague has just shared, that some of the challenges are not, we cannot, like in when it comes to quality of education in performance and issues, access, and learning outcomes, you'll find that the results or the performance reflects with some bias, because you find the girls would excel mostly in the STEAM or the arts, while the boys seem to have a tendency to affiliate themselves to the STEM side of subjects. And this is very true, because from our statistical booklet, Kenya, and also from the KDHS, our Kenya Democratic Health Survey, our economic survey, if you can just check, you'll find that we actually have made great milestones towards gender parity in Kenya, and especially so at primary level. where actually we are saying that the gender parity stands at actually it is at 1. Even in secondary, we are talking of a parity rate of we are actually at parity. So not because we are at 1 as to 1, but the gender parity is 0.96, and that one tells you that we are actually bridging the gap to that extent. However, the barriers still exist. Some of the challenges that we face in Kenya actually are in line with what the researchers have brought out, and I've liked the indication that we have also tried to respond as the challenges come by. You talked of economic barriers and investment in boys, as well as in discipline issues. When it comes to economic issues, as far as affecting the ability to access education among boys and girls, because we do not discriminate. As you are aware, we talk of inclusion and the provision of education to all. So we have made the education in Kenya very affordable. We have free primary education, to say, and that tells you that every child is actually free to access basic education at primary level. When it comes to secondary, we have what we call free day secondary education. And that one tells you if a household is not able to afford to take their child to a boarding facility, we have an alternative where we provide free day secondary education. And therefore, we have actually our day schools, for that matter, account for over 70% of the schools we have in the country. And that one tells us that we can comfortably say, we can say that our children can access education at their, depending on the households. However, we are not in denial of the fact that economic issues are there and they are a barrier to education. What we have done as Kenya, we have put in place interventions, including supplementing. Actually, like we have a textbook policy whereby we provide textbooks to the schools free of charge. And so the parents have no burden of buying teaching learning resources are provided by government and all that. So some of these come in to cushion the right to access education issues and investment in boys. We say that we do not discriminate against any of the sexes, and therefore, yeah. However, you may find that a number of programs may be in favor of girls, fine, but it is within a reasonable understanding the fact that with all the issues that we talk about, girls actually face distinct challenges in accessing and succeeding in education. And that is why you may find like, it may look like we have an affiliation to supporting girls, but the fact is girls and women generally may find themselves with more challenges that may hinder them from educational opportunities, and probably that is the reasoning behind some of these support programs that seem to be in favor of girls than boys. However, we still have programs like when it comes to empowering the households in terms of providing scholarships. Actually, we do not discriminate. We give scholarships to both girls and the boys, but with some little bias on the girl child, whereby, like you'll find the policy, we say we give, we may have a program that gives 55% of the scholarships to girls, and the rest now goes to boys. So you find they start that tendency to to give more to the girl child. And it is because of those intricacies that we have just pointed out. When it comes to discipline, actually, the teachers would have said that truly the boys seem to, maybe the punishment given to boys may be harsh than that one that goes to the girls and all that. And for Kenya, what we have done is that we have developed a positive discipline manual for the teachers. A positive discipline manual has come in place to support teachers to handle discipline among the learners. And this is a manual that is just very fresh. We have just completed it last year, and it is actually out there for the teachers to use and any other educator. It's a positive part of positive parenting approaches, and therefore the positive discipline manual for basic education comes in handy to support this. And so we do sensitization to the teachers so that they do not have these biases. For sure, some of the barriers that we have in education, of course, we address them through the curriculum. The curriculum is rich in, it is actually engendered. We have an engendered curriculum and the programs that support the girls and the boys equally to access education at their, without discrimination. So I don't know whether I have more time to continue talking about Kenya, but it is true that the enrollment has improved over the years towards parity, but you'll find a lot of disparity as we go up tertiary level of education. That is where the challenge is, where you'll find there's a tendency to have a greater representation of males than the female gender. And just to take, I was just looking at our DHS and our statistical booklet, and it was placing as follows: that we have a TVET, we have a male representation of 54.6%, while that of female is 43.6%. And this gives us a gender parity of 0.77. So that one tells you that the proportions are challenged as we go up there, up the ladder of education. And maybe IPA and the team and all of us should be asking ourselves, what happens as we go? What are these issues that come to affect the genders or the two, the boys and the girls as we go up the education ladder? Because empowerment is very, very essential to make the two able to make it in. When we look at the Kenyan situation, apart from providing a free day and a free primary education and a free day secondary school, we have come up with specific pathways. Yeah, we have pathways that will encourage even those that drop out of school, if they girls, continue with their education pursuit. And when it comes to Kenya, the re-entry guidelines, we call them the re-entry guidelines of 2020, they actually came in the right time when COVID had just struck the world. They are not just for girls. It is re-entry guidelines for school children, school-age children, who may drop out of school for whatever reason, be it a pregnancy, be it a drug addiction, be it whatever. They are given avenues to re-enter and complete their education pursuit. So the re-entry guidelines for Kenya are not only for girls, they are for any other that is willing to come back to school, and the guidelines are given clearly on how to readmit whatever the issue, including indiscipline, So we are open to supporting the learners because the approach is supportive. It is not punitive. So we just support the learner to re-enter with the guidance and counseling programs, yeah, and even scholarships so that they can be able to pursue their education dream. I was talking about the parity ratios. In secondary, we said it is at 1. In the university, I was finding the data, and it was saying that we are at actually 0.68%, with 58.4% male and 41.6% female. That one tells us that we need to find out what happens as we go up the levels of education. So,
Madam Phyllis,
yes.
Thank you so much. Obviously, we can go the whole day talking about these very interesting discussions today. But yeah, thank you so much for the comprehensive response to this, and you expressing how it is in Kenya based on your rich experience with the Ministry of Education. But I want to give Debbie a chance to also react to one of our questions. So Debbie, I know you're a passionate educator with over 2 decades experience in the education sector. So I was curious to know, in relation to your context and your work, maybe you could discuss a little bit about any specific challenges or barriers that boys face in accessing or succeeding in education.
All right, thank you so much, Vicky. Just speaking to what you're asking, is that in communities that we work in, so at Girl Rising, we actually create resources. We collaborate with community, grassroots community organizations to implement the resources, and we activate that the communities lead the change that we expect. And so these resources actually build the voice in the adolescents that we work with. We want them to have agency within their lives and in their education so that they are able to persist, to achieve their dreams and succeed, to thrive in their education as well. And also just seek support whenever they face adversity, whenever in their education. And so as we work in communities, I want to speak to the research papers that have been presented. Is that at Girl Rising, initially our program was to work with girls. And so when we got into communities to work with them, the facilitators of our resources were like, this is very important information. The knowledge and the skills you're giving should also be implemented for the boys. And so we had to include the boys. And just looking at the assumption that the girl is at a pedestal and that they are at a privileged, they have been given privilege. I would like to mention that we have not achieved the required threshold in that, just like Ms. Phyllis has mentioned. But looking at boys, we always treat them as part of the movement, including them in our programs, because looking at gender equity, there's no way you can speak of boys and speak of girls and leave out the boys. But we found that there, like the research mentions, that there isn't much that is being done for the boys, and that outcry is there even in communities where we work. And you find that there are differences. You find that in the informal settlements in Nairobi, like Kibera, Kawangware, what the challenges you find there for boys will be different from when you move to rural Kenya. And so looking at some of the challenges that boys face, they were mentioned a lot in the research paper. We look at economic barriers where boys are given responsibilities. I know when, like in some communities, you find that when boys attain a certain age, they are perceived as adults, especially when they have transitioned from being boys to adults. There's a certain age. And so when they pass that rite of passage, they are expected to fend for their families. And they also have this feeling we got from the facilitator that the boys feel that when they've attained a certain age and they're attracting friends from the opposite gender, they start having, we call them girlfriends and boyfriends. it's more prestigious when a boy has money, unlike when they do not have. And so they would rather skip school to go harvest sand, to go ride the boda, the piki, you were saying, so that they can make money. One, to provide for their families because they need to, and the boys also to just have their own money. We also have communities that do not value education for either boys or girls. So communities that we work in, we realize that as they transition to high school, like Ms. Phyllis mentioned, maybe this would support her fact, is that let me give a story. So we had just finished a camp in December for both boys and girls in Samburu. And so over a cup of chai, we were just chatting, and I asked the teachers how the KCP results went and how the transition to high school will be planned for the boys and the girls. And she said, you look at our list, the top 10, about 6 are girls and 4 are boys. You can be very sure that the boys will be promoted to go to high school because the parents would rather invest in boys' education and not girls. And the girls, if you do not follow up with a scholarship, we will find them married. And so those are some of the differences you find. But when you come to Kibera, in Nairobi, Kibera, Kangware, you'll find support for education is for both boys and girls. We also have just sheer apathy, lack of goodwill to ensure that boys go to school. There's also the pessimism about the future for boys. So the boys feel like school sometimes may not make them achieve what they really want, because if they come from a social economic background that is disadvantaged, they would rather start doing things in their communities like keeping cattle, sometimes in the rural Kenya, so that they have what they can build quickly for their future. When we talk of indiscipline for boys, we found that there is the feeling of not being connected to school. So you find that most of the programs that have been set up in schools favor girls, especially when we talk of life skills. So there's the human bit, there's the academic bit that Mr. Munga and Ms. Phyllis have mentioned it, but these boys and girls come from communities. And so the communities that boys come from, they are treated like boys do not have emotions. They are not vulnerable. They're supposed to remain strong. Even in school, the kind of punishment, like Ms. Phyllis mentioned, sometimes it's tough for the boys and not for the girls. And so that these little subtle things make boys feel not connected to school. Also, drug and substance abuse could be a disadvantage for some of them. It's not really in high tones, but those who are affected by it, it is an effect that is negative, detrimental to the performance of boys. And then we also have low expectations regarding academic achievement in some areas. We also have poor attitude and unconstructive interactions among the students themselves. So you'll find boys are easily swayed to the negative and like the girls. And so with this, I think I've just mentioned a few and some of the challenges, but working with both boys and girls, we feel like there is support. So we are part of the campaign that boys are always and will be part of the movement for education with regard to gender equity. There's no way we will separate those. And much as we focus on girls, this does not translate not neglecting the boys. We are looking at the boys, but unfortunately, like it has been earlier mentioned, historically, girls and women have been discriminated against to an extent that we're still advocating for countering gender-based discrimination. So in terms of challenges, I think I have mentioned those, but there is needed support for both boys and girls, especially in stereotypes. We do not just assume that the stereotypes that exist, the gender stereotypes, do not just affect boys. They also affect girls, like I have mentioned before. Thank you, Vicky.
Thanks so much, Debbie, for those rich insights. Maybe, Sarah, if you could kindly go to the next slide. Maybe this might be my last question to panelists so that we give about 10 minutes for Brianda or us all to check if there are any questions from the participants or from the audience. And maybe Debbie, I'll give you 30 seconds. Then Mr. Munga, I'll give you 30 seconds. And then Miss Phyllis, I'll give you 30 seconds kindly just to respond to this question. So how can policymakers, researchers, and education sector partners collaborate more effectively to advance gender equality in education and also to ensure that both boys and girls have equal opportunities to thrive academically? Maybe you can just react to that in relation to your context and experiences. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vicky. So I feel that we need to recognize the importance of engaging boys, especially in the effort to change the way girls and women are seen, so that there is that correlation between the two sex and gender. We also ought to be, the boys also ought to be taught the importance of an equitable world. We really need to do that as policy makers, researchers, education sector. And I like the fact that the Kenya government have recognized that there is importance in ensuring provision of quality education and looking at the transition from the former curriculum that was exam-oriented into the competency-based curriculum where all students are looked at with their competences. So we do not have either boy or girl getting out of school. We have equal transition and follow-up for them to transition from primary to high school. Thank you.
Thanks, Debbie. Mr. Munga?
Thank you so much. I think from my perspective.
Mr. Munga, maybe, yes, you can move closer to your mic. Thank you.
Hello, are you getting me? Hello?
Yes, we are. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think from my perspective is that the way we need to collaborate, if I'm to take from the Zambian experience, there are quite a lot of assessments which are done. Of course, most of them, they have been targeted towards the girls. And it's good that the boy child is also coming in the realm of research. But even as they are done, the partners, you would find that they are just segmented. There seems to be no common framework upon which the assessments and the research could be done, even among the partners. So it all starts with the framework. If we are to come up with an assessment framework, so much that all the partners who are doing their research, they need to feed in that particular framework. Basically, what happens in Zambia is that there is quite so much research which is done, but it's segmented. You would find that these partners are doing this research. In the same research, another partner will come and do the same research. So it's like there is a repetitive of the research activity due to lack of probably a more a direct framework which everyone should be feeding in. And basically, the issue of a separation between the policymakers and the researchers, that also has been the main aspect that I've seen, that we seem to be, again, segmented. The researchers, yes, they are doing the research, but to what extent are those research reaching out to the policymakers? Again, at that particular aspect, there seems to be a gap. So as we bridge the gap between the policymakers and the researchers and the educationists, so that we all have a common understanding of the challenges which are happening. When I hear from the Kenya perspective, and also when I listen to the presentations that have been done, it seems the challenges that we have, probably as sub-Saharan Africa, or probably as Africa, they seem to be common. And hence, we, in fact, need also to see how, even as Africa, we may have a common assessment framework which will guide our policies and so on and so forth. Probably to me, that's what I would say as it now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Munga. Phyllis, I'll give you 30 seconds also just to share your thoughts, and then we'll go to the audience. Oh, sorry, Phyllis, I think you are muted. You need to unmute. No, we can't. I'm reading your lips. I think you're asking if we can hear you. Yes.
I'm there now. Yeah, I was saying that basically these challenges that are persistent in our gender space, we have definitely to do something about it, because despite the efforts that we have made to close the gender gap in education, actually we find the challenges are still persistent, and the beauty is that we can identify the challenges that we have. And therefore, continuous efforts are required to ensure that equal access to quality education for our children, or for the children in our countries in Africa, are actually met regardless of their gender. And key among a bit of this is continuous research, because from the papers that have been presented, we can now hear it from an informed position, so that we are making decisions that are evidence-based. So I would really that we continue collaborating with our stakeholders, our partners, to do we do research and share the findings, and because we realize that actually the issue of data is it is very scarce. It's not available. So we need to do data collection, and so that we can also plan effectively for this. Because like when it comes to gender responsive budgeting and all that financing, then we cannot get it right if we don't have the data is not correct. So actually this issue require a lot of what I can call multifaceted approach, and we address all these issues that are affecting our girls and boys equally by collaborating, so that we do sensitizations, address some of the gaps that we are facing, and also make our communities aware of what is right for our children, our boys and girls. Thank you.
Thank you. Definitely in agreement there. Thank you so much, Phyllis, as well. So should I turn it over to you, Sarah, now?
Great.
Or Leander, if any questions?
Just want to thank, our panel. Thank you so much. These reflections are really interesting, and it's so helpful to hear about all of the ongoing work that is, sort of engaging with these issues. I think one of the key themes to highlight here is just the complexity and nuance of this subject, right? And so thinking about all of the variation that we see. So at level of education, by subject, within country, geographically, I think this is just so important. And, I think one of the questions coming through the chat is, what do we make of this? When do gaps matter and why? Is this indicative of progress that we've seen on girls' education? What should we be concerned about? And so I think one key thing to highlight is, that coming through some of the presentations is, for the theme of equity or understanding pivotal skills or transitions being really important. Like Laura mentioned in her presentation, how reading is a particularly important skill and considered a gateway skill. So if we see that boys are really struggling with reading, that might be an early indication of longer term challenges, or, being able to address these trajectories at really critical points. But then Mr. Munga and Ms. Phyllis's emphasis about tertiary education and higher education still, sort of being very much more favorable to boys and seeing higher rates of boys engagement there. I think then opening that up to a really important question, which is that even when we see girls succeeding academically, that might not translate into later labor force outcomes and other longer term outcomes sort of advancing for women's equity. And so understanding all of this complexity, I think, is hugely important. So I just wanted to quickly turn to Laura to see if you could comment a little bit about the levels of education, right? So as we're starting to see some of these trends, and you mentioned this a little bit in your presentation as well, is that, historically we've seen boys scoring much higher, particularly in STEM fields, but that's beginning to change. And then also just, sort of looking at from this global perspective, the levels. So in some areas, we definitely see much more girls' engagement in higher education, but that might not be true in other areas. So I wonder if Laura, you could comment a little bit on there and just, sort of some of the complexity that I think really comes through in your report. And then I'll follow up with a final question for Rebecca.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. This has been a really rich discussion, and some great points have been made. On this issue of the, where is it important? I think, there is variation. Every country is different. When we've even heard within countries, there's different issues. I think those foundational skills and those early skills of literacy and numeracy, if they slip for whichever children, that is a problem. So even though we're seeing in the data the bigger gaps, for example, in tertiary education enrollment, in completion, and this type of thing, a focus on primary is still really necessary, even if we're seeing similar sort of enrollment rates and that type of thing. I think just if I could quickly, as I know not much time, reflect on some of the things that said related to that. If the focus is on boys at risk, then I think you can avoid this dichotomy conversation. Is it girls doing better? Is it boys doing better? It's not. It's really kids at risk that we're looking at. And some of them are boys, and in early grade reading, that's definitely an issue we see in a lot of countries. I think the second thing I really liked raised about the framework. I was surprised today how aligned we are already in our frameworks with the, the economic and labor market issues, the social norms. And then I think adding in this education one, the classroom, what's really happening in the classroom, really great to hear about the positive discipline guidance to schools in Kenya. That I think I fully agree. If we can kind of come together on this framework, that would be great. The in-depth country studies are so important because of these nuances and differences within countries. But learning from others is also really useful. So I worked a lot in the Middle East and North Africa. There's some very interesting things that have been done in Oman in particular, in Saudi Arabia, where the big gaps have happened, some big moves like in Oman, school principals are all females now. In Saudi Arabia, the kids were separated from grade 1, and now the youngest are being taught by the best teachers. And then finally, on the school climate and the positive discipline, I think this is an area that, it's a policy area that can be actioned quite easily when we look into that. It's affecting boys more than girls, most likely. So crucially important. Thanks, Sarah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I just want to, for our last word, turn it to Rebecca. I think, feel free to comment. I think on this theme of variation really comes through in your work that, even across these 3 countries, we see on average this performance, but that, you're starting to look into which factors are driving that, but then where there is, sort of certain counties or other regional areas where, we see different trends, but then also to talk more broadly as well about, some of your ongoing research, even looking at pre-primary and in the early childhood, some of these gaps starting to emerge. So feel free to comment.
Sure. I think there's a lot of really exciting education data sets, and it was very exciting to hear Laura talk about new ones on civic education. There's a lot with skills with adults, lots that people could get involved with working on and looking at these gender gaps. We've been putting together data from the MIX survey, the multi-indicator cluster survey, to look at pre-primary school readiness skills and gaps across sub-Saharan Africa. There we do see about 2 to 3 standard deviation gaps in pre-readiness among young kids, but with lots of variation across country, across other settings. I think also that the idea of heterogeneity, that when we think about who is falling behind, I think these gender gaps are important, looking at boys, looking at girls, and then looking at other ways of looking at disparities. Sometimes we have missed on disability, sometimes we have missed on urban, rural, different ethnic groups, disadvantaged groups, that there are lots of kids who are in need and have gaps, and that's important to keep in mind, and just continuing to document that and thinking broadly about that.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, so we are at time. Thank you everyone so much for your participation today, especially to our presenters and panelists. This has been a wonderful opportunity to engage. And, so we think of this very much as an initial step and exploratory conversation. We're so excited, and especially on the calls for more data and research, we think, as always, is music to our ears at IPA. So again, thank you everyone for participating. Please feel free to be in touch, as these issues are relevant across practitioner, policy, and research conversations. We're really excited to continue. So have a wonderful day, and thank you again so much for participating.
Welcome. Thank you.